Welcome to Say the Right Thing, a toolkit for responding to those experiencing gender-based violence survivors and their families. A training designed specifically for Canadian health professionals. Today we'll explore how to provide compassionate, trauma-informed care to those affected by gender-based violence while honoring their diverse experiences and identities. This presentation was made possible through funding from the Government of Prince Edward Island and the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence. I'm Rachael Crowder, and among other identities, I am a clinical therapist in private practice, a former academic and published researcher, and have taken on executive leadership roles in several nonprofit gender-based violence-focused organizations. And I love teaching, especially trauma-informed practice with survivors of gender-based violence and their allies. During this presentation, we'll work together to build your capacity in several key areas. We'll establish a shared understanding of what gender-based violence looks like in the Canadian context. We'll examine how intersectionality shapes different experiences of violence. We'll practice trauma-informed communication techniques you can use immediately. We will then review evidence-based protocols for responding effectively and safely, providing culturally safe and identity-affirming care. By the end, you'll have practical tools to support survivors while maintaining your own professional boundaries. To effectively recognize gender-based violence, we need to look beyond physical injuries and understand the spectrum of behaviors used to exert control. A foundational framework, first published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal in 1997, was developed from the candid accounts of men who had been abusive. It remains one of the most detailed tools we have for identifying non-physical abuse. It categorizes abuse into several key types, which we can see here. These include emotional, environmental, social, and financial abuse, tactics designed to break a person's spirit and independence. It also includes the more recognized forms of physical, sexual, and spiritual abuse, as well as the critical subset of reproductive abuse, which involves control over reproductive choices. While this framework is foundational, the landscape of control has evolved dramatically since 1997. We must now add a ninth critical category, technology-facilitated abuse. This is a primary tactic of control today. It includes using GPS tracking, spyware, monitoring social media, non-consensual sharing of intimate images, and digital stalking to harass, intimidate, and isolate a survivor. By understanding this full spectrum, from the subtle emotional put-down to overt physical violence, and now including the digital realm, we can better recognize the patterns of control that define gender-based violence, even when there are no visible marks. While intimate partner violence and sex trafficking can overlap, sex trafficking is a distinct crime focused on exploitation for profit. It involves recruiting, moving, or holding victims through force, fraud, or coercion to provide sexual services. In a clinical setting, recognizing it requires looking for a constellation of signs, not just one indicator. First, listen to the story. Often, the explanation for injuries is vague or inconsistent. A qualitative study of Canadian service providers noted that an obvious sign was a patient, quote, coming in with random bruises, and every other day they're claiming to be falling down a set of stairs, end quote. Another major red flag is a controlling third party who refuses to leave the room or insists on translating, which prevents the patient from speaking freely. Second, look for specific physical and sexual health indicators. Recurrent or multiple STIs can be a sign of coerced, unprotected sex. You may also see pelvic, rectal, or urinary trauma. Physical signs like unexplained bruises or scars in various stages of healing are also common. Third, observe the patient's behavior. They may appear fearful, anxious, or avoid eye contact. They might seem disconnected or depressed. Some survivors have been branded by their traffickers with a tattoo. A key dynamic to watch for is the unusual attachment or profound fear they may express towards the person controlling them. Finally, consider the element of control and isolation. Victims often do not have control over their own money, phone, or ID. They may not know what city they're in, and the person with them may be holding their documents. It's crucial to remember that in Canada, a significant portion of trafficking is perpetuated by an intimate partner. So don't dismiss the possibility if the person present claims to be a boyfriend or girlfriend. If you suspect trafficking, do not confront the alleged trafficker. Your priority is to create an opportunity for the patient to be alone. The Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline is a confidential national resource that can provide immediate guidance and support. It's provided here on the slide and also in the resource guide. Intersectionality helps us understand how overlapping social identities create unique experiences of both privilege and oppression. In the Canadian context, we must consider how Indigenous status intersects with gender to create specific vulnerabilities, how race and ethnicity affect access to services, how socioeconomic status impacts safety options, how disability status can increase dependence on potentially abusive caregivers, how immigration status might create barriers to seeking help, and how LGBTQIA+ identity can result in specific forms of violence while limiting access to appropriate care. These aren't additive factors. They create unique, compounding experiences that require tailored responses. Gender-based violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's rooted in systemic factors like patriarchal structures that devalue women and gender-diverse people, Canada's colonial legacy that continues to marginalize Indigenous peoples, and economic disparities that create dependence and limit options. Social determinants like housing insecurity, lack of accessible services in rural and remote communities, community violence, and intergenerational trauma, particularly among Indigenous peoples, all contribute to higher rates of gender-based violence. Understanding these root causes helps us move from asking, "What's wrong with this person?" to "What happened to this person?" Trauma-informed care operates on 5 core principles. Safety means creating physical, emotional, and cultural safety, considering everything from the clinic environment to our choice of words. Trustworthiness involves being clear about boundaries and maintaining consistency in our interactions. Choice means empowering patients to make decisions about their care and their lives. Collaboration recognizes the patient as the expert in their own experience. And cultural humility requires us to acknowledge our own limitations and learn from diverse cultural approaches to healing and wellness. As health professionals, you're already experts in systematic approaches to patient care. The 4Rs framework for responding to gender-based violence builds directly on that clinical mindset. It's a best practice model synthesized from trauma-informed care principles and public health guidelines promoted by organizations like the Public Health Agency of Canada. This framework gives us a clear, evidence-based pathway to follow, turning a daunting conversation into a manageable process. It's designed to ensure our response is consistent, compassionate, and safe. The first R is to recognize the signs. This goes far beyond obvious physical injuries, as we've said in previous slide. We're talking about recognizing the subtle chronic patterns, the frequent anxiety or depression, the unexplained somatic complaints, the partner who seems overly controlling or answers all the questions, or the patient who appears guarded or fearful in the presence of their partner. Your clinical assessment skills are your first and most powerful tool here. Second, we must respond appropriately and compassionately. This is the heart of the matter, and where saying the right thing is critical. A trauma-informed response involves listening without judgment and validating their experience with statements like, "I believe you," and "this is not your fault," and prioritizing their immediate safety and emotional needs. Third, we refer to specialized services. Our role is to be a trusted bridge to care, not the sole provider of it. This requires knowing what's available in our communities, from local women's shelters and crisis lines to culturally specific services for Indigenous clients or affirming support for LGBTQIA+ survivors. A warm handoff where you can facilitate the connection can make all the difference. And finally, we record documentation safely. This is a critical step for continuity of care and for legal purposes, but it must be done without creating additional danger for the patient. This means documenting objective facts, using the patient's own words in quotation marks, and avoiding speculative or judgmental language that could be misused. So while the topic of gender-based violence can feel overwhelming, this framework provides a structured, evidence-based approach that aligns with the clinical skills you already use every day. It's about applying your expertise in assessment, communication, and care planning to this sensitive context, ensuring that when a patient trusts us with their story, we have a reliable and effective way to respond. When someone discloses or you suspect gender-based violence, there are clear do's and don'ts. Do listen without judgment. Your silence can be healing. Do validate their experience with phrases like, "I believe you," and "this is not your fault." Do ask permission before any physical examination or touching. Use person-first language. Say, "person who has experienced trauma," rather than "victim." Don't ask, "Why didn't you leave?" This blames the survivor. Don't minimize their experience with phrases like, "At least he didn't... .. Don't make assumptions about their gender identity, sexuality, or relationship structure. And don't pressure for details they're not ready to share. Cultural safety requires us to understand and respect diverse contexts. For Indigenous patients, this might mean recognizing the impact of residential schools and the importance of community healing approaches. For immigrants and refugees, it means understanding how migration trauma, legal status, and separation from support systems affect their experience. For all patients, it means using interpreters when needed, respecting cultural practices around family and privacy, and avoiding assumptions about what constitutes family or help. Remember, cultural safety isn't about learning everything about every culture. It's about creating a space where cultural differences can be safely expressed and respected. LGBTQIA+ people face unique challenges regarding gender-based violence. Statistics show higher rates of intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships, often compounded by fear of discrimination from service providers. Unique forms of gender-based violence include threats to out someone, controlling gender expression, or using identity as a weapon. To provide affirming care, always use correct pronouns and names. If you're not sure, ask respectfully. Create inclusive intake forms that recognize diverse relationship structures. Display inclusive symbols like rainbow flags or trans-inclusive signs in your clinic or your workplace. And remember that LGBTQIA+ survivors may have experienced trauma not just from the violence itself, but from homophobic or transphobic responses when seeking help. Opening the conversation requires skill and sensitivity. Try, "I noticed some concerns during our assessment. Would you be comfortable talking about your relationships?" Or, "Many of my patients experience difficulties in their relationships. Is everything okay at home?" When someone discloses, respond with something like, "Thank you for trusting me with this. What you're experiencing is not your fault. How can I support you right now?" And if they're not ready to talk, respond with something like, "That's completely okay. I'm here whenever you're ready. Your well-being is my priority." Safety planning must be collaborative and tailored to each person's situation. Begin with an immediate safety assessment like, "Are you safe right now?" Consider technology safety. Many abusers monitor phones and computers. Have emergency contacts readily available but stored safely. For documentation, using encrypted apps or secure password-protected files are preferred. And remember that safety planning isn't just about leaving, it's about reducing harm wherever the person is in their journey. For some, immediate safety might mean creating a code word with friends or keeping a bag packed. For others, it might mean accessing a shelter or changing locks. For more information on safety planning essentials, you can refer to this link that I've put in the slide to the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which can help you get more familiar what a safety plan looks like and or as a resource for your patients. And now we're talking about your own documentation, your clinical documentation. It requires a careful balance. So make sure you're recording objective observations, what you saw, heard, and assessed. And wherever possible, quote your patient's own words when possible. So something like, quote, "The patient states, 'He threatened to kill me if he left.'" Document safety assessment findings clearly, but avoid speculation or judgment. So something like, "Patient seems manipulative or exaggerating," are inappropriate. And also victim blaming language like "provoked" or "contributed to" is also not appropriate. and avoid unnecessary details that could identify the patient if records are accessed. Remember, your documentation could be used in court proceedings, so clarity and objectivity are essential. Knowing your resources is crucial. In emergencies, always call 911 for immediate support. The National Gender-Based Violence Hotline is here on the slide. It provides 24/7 confidential support. Build relationships with local shelters and crisis centers. Know their capacity and requirements. For Indigenous clients, connect with Indigenous specific services that understand cultural protocols. For LGBTQIA+ clients, know which services are affirming and experienced with these communities. Keep an updated resource list in your clinic. There's a guide that comes with this webinar, and there is a link provided at the end. But above all, remember to give your patient control over how and when they access these services. And just a moment to mention personal and collective well-being. This work is demanding, and vicarious trauma is real. Recognize the signs: feeling numb, overly emotional, or avoiding patients with trauma histories. Set clear professional boundaries. You can't be their therapist and their healthcare provider. Engage in peer support and regular supervision. Practice debriefing after difficult cases. Even 5 minutes of reflection can help. Remember, caring for yourself isn't selfish. It's essential for sustainable, compassionate care. As the saying goes, and you've probably heard before, you can't pour from an empty cup. So let's move from theory to practice now and apply the framework we've discussed to some realistic scenarios. For each of the following 3 case studies, I want you to think about how you would respond as a health professional. Grab a notebook or open a document, and for each scenario, I encourage you to journal your thoughts on these 3 questions. Recognize what signs of GBV or potential risk factors are present in this scenario. Respond. How would you initiate a conversation? What is the first thing you would say? And refer. What immediate next steps or referrals would you consider? So this first scenario is a 28-year-old Indigenous woman who presents for a routine checkup. She seems anxious and makes poor eye contact. When you ask about her health, she mentions frequent headaches and trouble sleeping, but has no clear physical cause. Her partner, who accompanied her, answers most of her questions and dismisses her concerns as just being stressed. So pause now and reflect on this first scenario, and then come back. And now for our second scenario. A 19-year-old non-binary patient comes in for STI testing. They mentioned their new partner is very protective and recently asked them to delete their social media accounts. The patient seems hesitant to provide their phone number for follow-up appointments, saying their partner gets jealous about calls. So, recognize what signs of gender-based violence are present, how you would initiate the conversation with this patient, and what are the immediate next steps that you would consider. So pause for reflection and journaling, and then come back for the final scenario. So here's scenario number 3. A 55-year-old recent immigrant from a country with known conflict who speaks limited English presents with a broken wrist. When you ask how it happened, their adult child who is translating says, "They fell down the stairs." The patient avoids eye contact and appears withdrawn while the child speaks for them. So once more, pause to reflect, and then come back when you're ready. There are no single perfect answers, but thinking through these challenges is how we build our capacity to respond effectively. To help you process your reflections, I've created a brief answer key at the very end of this presentation. It outlines some key considerations and possible approaches for each scenario. Please feel free to navigate there whenever you feel ready to review it. And I want to ensure you have access to the evidence that informs this presentation, so I've compiled a list of key references and resources for your continued learning. The foundational frameworks for gender-based violence prevention in Canada come from the Public Health Agency of Canada's 2022 Pan-Canadian Framework and the Federal Gender-Based Violence Strategy. The statistics we discussed are drawn from the most recent Statistics Canada profile on family violence from 2023, which provides comprehensive national data. Our definition of gender-based violence aligns with the global standard set by the World Health Organization. Our approach to trauma-informed care is grounded in the SAMHSA guidelines from 2014, which remains the gold standard. For understanding the specific context of Indigenous peoples, the National Inquiry's final report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls from 2019 is essential reading. For LGBTQIA+ affirming care, the data from TransPulse Canada is vital for understanding the unique vulnerabilities and needs of these communities. Finally, the detailed abuse taxonomy we discussed comes from a 1997 CMAJ article by Martin and Younger-Lewis, which remains a highly practical tool for recognizing the spectrum of controlling behaviors. These resources, along with others, are listed in the handout you'll receive. I encourage you to explore them to support your practice and advocate for systemic change. While this isn't a live session, I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on what you've learned. What resonated most with you today? What challenges do you anticipate when implementing these approaches in your own practice? The QR code on this slide, when scanned by the camera app on your smartphone, will take you to our evaluation form. I hope you will take a few minutes to complete this form to help me improve future sessions. At the end of the evaluation is a link to download our community referral guide. Feel free to share this guide with your colleagues and with your patients. If you have follow-up questions, you can reach me at Rachael@presentmoment.ca. You're not alone in this work, and your commitment to compassionate, trauma-informed care makes a real difference in people's lives. And one more thing, the case study reflection guide follows this slide. This appendix is designed to support your reflection on the case studies. For the first scenario involving the Indigenous woman, the key is recognizing the partner's control and finding a safe way to speak with her alone. For the non-binary patient, affirming their identity and addressing the technology-based control is paramount. And for the immigrant patient, the priority is overcoming the language and family barriers to ensure the patient can speak for themselves with a professional interpreter. These guides offer starting points, but remember that every situation is unique. Thank you for your engagement and commitment to this important work.